From the moment we are children, many of us hear the story, the tale of how man was created first, then woman formed his rib. It's a narrative that has shaped cultures, laws, and beliefs for centuries. In countless homes, schools, and places of worship, this version of creation has been passed down as sacred truth. We have grown up believing that Eve came from Adam's side, not just symbolically, but literally. And with that belief came a set of assumptions: that man was primary, woman secondary, that woman was born from man's body and therefore existed in relation to him. This story has influenced everything, from gender roles to religious doctrine, from social norms to personal identity. It has defined relationships, shaped expectations, and even justified systems of power and control. But what if this story was never meant to be taken literally? What if the word rib was never the original meaning at all? What if one small translation error, made long ago, changed the course of history? To understand the true meaning behind this ancient text, we must go back to its source, not the English version we know, but the original Hebrew words that were spoken, written, and preserved for thousands of years. Because when we look at the original language, something remarkable emerges: a deeper, more profound understanding of creation, unity, and the nature of being. And it all begins with one word. In the second chapter of Genesis, there is a passage that reads, "And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man, made he a woman." This is the foundation of the widely accepted story, that woman was made from man's rib. But let's take a closer look at the original Hebrew text. The key word here is tsela, commonly translated as rib. However, scholars and linguists have long pointed out that tsela does not actually mean rib in the anatomical sense. Its root meaning is far broader, encompassing ideas like side, part, chamber, or even essence. In some contexts, it refers to a structural component of a building, such as the side chamber of a temple. So why did translators choose rib? The answer lies in interpretation, and perhaps in cultural bias. Early translations, including the Septuagint, chose the word pleura, meaning side or rib. This choice was carried forward into Latin and eventually into English Bibles, where it became cemented in our collective consciousness. But the original Hebrew suggests something very different, that Adam was not missing a literal rib, but rather that a part of him, a whole side, was taken to create another being, not a fragment, not a lesser piece, but an equal half. This changes everything. Instead of a hierarchy, male first, female second, the story reveals itself as one of duality, balance, and wholeness. Man and woman were not created separately, nor was one derived from the other. They were once united, two halves of the same whole, and only later divided into distinct beings. This is not just a theological observation. It is a radical reinterpretation of the very foundation of human identity. It suggests that the original human was neither male nor female, but both, a single entity, complete and unified. Only after separation did they become two, not superior and inferior, but complementary. And yet, this understanding has largely been buried beneath centuries of misinterpretation. Now, we must ask ourselves, why did this translation endure for so long? And what impact has it had on the world? To truly understand the impact of this translation error, we must look beyond the words themselves and into the cultural and historical context in which they were spoken. The ancient Hebrew worldview was deeply symbolic. Language was not just a tool for communication, but a vessel of divine truth. Words carried layers of meaning, often pointing to metaphysical realities rather than literal descriptions. In that world, creation myths were not meant to be taken as scientific accounts, but as spiritual teachings, maps for understanding the nature of being. At the time these texts were written, the dominant cultures of the Near East, including Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and early Semitic societies, held complex views on gender and divinity. Many believed in a dualistic cosmic order, where male and female energies were seen as complementary forces within the universe. Deities were often depicted as pairs, such as Osiris and Isis, Marduk and Ishtar, or El and Asherah, representing balance, unity, and the interplay between opposing yet harmonious principles. In this context, the story of Adam and Eve was never intended to establish a hierarchy of gender. It was a mythic expression of a deeper truth, that humanity was once whole and only later divided. The original human was not man alone, but an androgynous being, a single entity containing both masculine and feminine qualities. Only after separation did they become two distinct beings, each carrying a part of the original unity. This idea is echoed in other ancient traditions. In Plato's Symposium, there is a famous myth describing how humans were originally spherical beings with 2 faces, 4 arms, and 4 legs, powerful, whole, and unified. These beings challenged the gods, so Zeus split them in half, condemning them to seek their missing counterpart for eternity. This story, like the Genesis account, speaks to the same theme: the longing for reunion, the search for wholeness. Yet over time, as oral traditions became codified into scripture and translated across languages and cultures, something began to shift. The original message of unity and balance became obscured, replaced by interpretations that reflected the values of the societies that preserved them. As patriarchal structures grew stronger, especially during the Iron Age and later under Roman rule, religious and social institutions began reinforcing narratives that emphasized male dominance and female subordination. Women were increasingly excluded from positions of power, denied access to sacred knowledge, and portrayed as secondary beings, either temptresses or nurturers, but rarely equals. This shift wasn't accidental. It was a reflection of broader societal changes, the consolidation of political power, the rise of centralized religion, and the need to maintain control through doctrine and law. And at the heart of it all was one small word, mistranslated, misunderstood, and used to justify centuries of inequality. But what if we reclaim the original meaning? What if we return to the idea that man and woman were born from the same source, not one before the other, but together in perfect balance? This changes more than just our understanding of creation. It changes how we see ourselves as equal halves of a greater whole, not rulers, and subjects, not superior and inferior, but complementary expressions of consciousness. And perhaps most importantly, it challenges us to reconsider the way we view divinity itself. If the first human was neither fully male nor fully female, but a union of both, then the image of God, in whose likeness humanity was made, must also transcend gender. This suggests that God is not male nor female, but both. Not separate entities, but a divine duality, a sacred dance of opposites. This concept is not foreign to ancient thought. In many spiritual traditions, the divine is represented as a union: Shiva and Shakti in Hinduism, Yin and Yang in Taoism, Sophia and the divine word in Gnostic Christianity. Even in early Judaism, there are hints of this understanding in the presence of Sophia-like figures, in the feminine aspects of the divine, and in the lost wisdom of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God in Kabbalah. So when we read the story of Adam and Eve through this lens, we begin to see it not as a tale of subjugation, but as a myth of separation, a loss of balance, a forgetting of unity. And now, as we stand in a time when the sacred feminine is being remembered, reawakened, and restored, perhaps it is time to revisit this story not as it has been told, but as it was meant to be understood, because the truth may have been hidden, but it was never lost. Let's imagine for a moment that we strip away centuries of interpretation, that we let go of inherited assumptions and look at the story anew. What if the creation of woman was not an act of derivation, but of division? What if the formation of Adam and Eve was not a sequence, man first, woman second, but a simultaneous unfolding? In the beginning, according to the text, there was Adam, not man as we understand him today, but the first being, a complete and undivided essence. This being was not male in the biological sense. It was both, a singular unity containing the full spectrum of existence. Only later was this being separated, not because one was lesser than the other, but because individuality was necessary for experience. The soul could not grow in unity alone. It needed contrast. It needed difference. It needed to know itself through another. And so, the being was divided, not into ruler and subject, but into two equal halves, each carrying the fullness of the original. This radically transforms the narrative. Eve was not created from Adam's rib. She was not formed from a fragment of his body. She was drawn forth from his side, a symbol of equality, companionship, and shared origin. In fact, the very name Eve means life, not merely as motherhood, but as the source of all being. She is the breath, the spirit, the living force that animates existence. To reduce her to a derivative of man is to diminish the very essence of life itself. Now, consider the implications. If this story is not about hierarchy, but wholeness, then everything we've built upon it, theological doctrines, cultural norms, gender roles, must be re-examined. If the divine image is not male, but genderless or dual-gendered, then our entire perception of the sacred must shift. And if the original human was not man alone, but man and woman united, then perhaps the path forward is not dominance, but partnership. This is not a rejection of tradition. It is a reclamation of truth. It invites us to ask, how has this misinterpretation shaped our beliefs about gender? Why has the feminine aspect of the divine been diminished throughout history? And what happens when we begin to restore the balance? Because when we recognize that woman was never made from man, but was always his equal, we begin to heal the wound that has shaped civilizations. We begin to remember the sacred feminine. We begin to restore the lost voice of the feminine in spirituality. And we begin to see that the true meaning of creation is not division, but unity. This is not just a reinterpretation of an old story. It is a revelation, and it is happening now. Let us take a moment to revisit the core of this story, not as it has been told, but as it was meant to be understood. The creation of Adam and Eve is not about hierarchy. It is not about dominance or subordination. It is not about one gender being first and the other second. At its heart, this myth speaks of unity, balance, and wholeness. The original human Adam was not male in the way we understand masculinity today, nor was Eve simply a derivative of man. They were once one being, a single consciousness, a unified soul that contained both aspects within itself. This is not just poetic symbolism. It is a reflection of a deeper truth found across spiritual traditions, that the divine is not exclusively masculine or feminine, but both and beyond. In Hinduism, Shiva and Shakti represent the union of stillness and movement, consciousness and energy. In Taoism, yin and yang illustrate how opposites are not separate, but interdependent, each containing the seed of the other. In Gnostic Christianity, Sophia and the Word symbolize the feminine and masculine expressions of divine wisdom. And in early Judaism, before centuries of interpretation shifted the narrative, there were echoes of the Shekinah, the feminine presence of God dwelling among humanity. So why does it matter? Because when we reduce woman to a fragment of man, when we define her as rib, as lesser, as secondary, we do more than misinterpret an ancient text. We distort the very foundation of human identity. We create systems that favor one over the other. We shape cultures that silence voices that should be heard. We build religions that exclude half of the sacred. And perhaps most deeply, we fracture something within ourselves. Because if we believe that woman came from man, rather than seeing them as two halves of the same whole, then we begin to see separation where there should be unity. We see division where there should be balance. We see control where there should be coexistence. But what if we reclaim the original meaning? What if we return to the idea that man and woman were born from the same source, not one before the other, but together in perfect balance? That changes everything. It redefines our understanding of gender, of relationship, of spirituality. It tells us that woman was never made from man's rib. She was drawn forth from his side, a symbol of equality, companionship, and shared origin. It suggests that love between beings is not meant to be hierarchical, but mutual, not about possession, but partnership. And it reminds us that the soul carries both energies within it, that true wholeness comes not from identifying with only one aspect of being, but embracing the full spectrum of existence. This is not a rejection of tradition. It is a reclamation of truth. And it invites us to ask, how has this misinterpretation shaped our beliefs about gender? Why has the feminine aspect of the divine been diminished throughout history? And what happens when we begin to restore the balance? Because when we recognize that woman was never made from man, but was always his equal, we begin to heal the wound that has shaped civilizations. We begin to remember the sacred feminine. We begin to restore the lost voice of the feminine in spirituality. And we begin to see that the true meaning of creation is not division, but unity. This is not just a reinterpretation of an old story. It is a revelation, and it is happening now. This mistranslation did not remain confined to ancient scrolls. It seeped into the foundations of Western thought, shaping laws, doctrines, and cultural norms for centuries. As the Hebrew texts were translated into Greek, Latin, and later English, the word tsela became rib. And with that shift, a subtle but powerful transformation occurred, not just in language, but in worldview. Religious institutions began reinforcing narratives that emphasized male authority, female subservience, and hierarchical order. These ideas influenced everything from marriage customs to political structures, from theological doctrine to social expectations. Even in secular societies, echoes of this belief system persisted, reflected in the slow progress toward equality, the exclusion of women from leadership roles, and the long-standing assumption that men are naturally more suited to power, reason, and authority. But perhaps the most profound consequence of this translation error lies in how it shaped our understanding of the divine. If woman was created from man's rib, then God must also have a gender, and by implication, a masculine face. This reinforced the idea that divinity was primarily male, a notion that would dominate religious imagery, theology, and even the structure of spiritual practice for millennia. In many ways, this shift marked the beginning of the feminine exile, the gradual disappearance of the sacred feminine from mainstream spiritual discourse. The divine became increasingly associated with qualities like logic, strength, and authority, while intuition, compassion, and mystery were pushed into the background. Women were often excluded from priesthoods, philosophical schools, and mystical traditions, not because they lacked wisdom, but because the dominant narratives no longer saw them as equals in the eyes of the sacred. This had real consequences, not just for women, but for all of us. When we lose the feminine in the divine, we lose something essential within ourselves. We become disconnected from intuition, from nurturing, from the cycle of life and death, from the fluidity of being. We forget that wisdom is not only knowledge, but feeling. That strength is not only force, but resilience. That creation is not only action, but surrender. And so, the world began to tilt subtly at first, but over time, profoundly. Men were expected to embody rationality, dominance, and control. Women were encouraged to serve, support, and submit. And those who did not fit neatly into these roles were left without representation, their truths buried beneath layers of inherited belief. This is not just a historical observation. It is a living reality. Even today, we feel the ripples of this ancient misunderstanding. We see it in the struggle for equal rights, in the erasure of feminine wisdom, in the imbalance between masculine and feminine energies in society. But now, as we stand in a time when the sacred feminine is being remembered, reawakened, and restored, perhaps it is time to revisit this story, not as it has been told, but as it was meant to be understood, because the truth may have been hidden, but it was never lost. Now, more than ever, we are witnessing a global shift, a reawakening to the sacred feminine, a return to balance, and a deep questioning of inherited beliefs. People are beginning to ask, what stories have shaped my understanding of gender? Who decided which interpretations were correct, and who benefited from those decisions? What might I be missing by accepting these narratives at face value? This video is not just about correcting a translation. It is about liberation from outdated paradigms, from limiting beliefs, and from the illusion that one gender is superior to another. It is an invitation to look beyond the surface of ancient texts, to dig deeper, to question assumptions, and to seek the original intention behind the words. And above all, it is a reminder that we are not defined by the stories we inherit. We are free to rewrite them. Because when we understand that woman was not created from man's rib, but from his side, we begin to see the deeper message, that we were never meant to rule or be ruled. We were meant to walk together as equal halves of the same whole. And when we live from that truth, not just in relationships, but in every interaction, we begin to heal the divisions that have shaped our world. So I leave you with this final thought. You are not here to dominate. You are not here to submit. You are here to remember your wholeness and to live from that place. Whether you identify as man or woman, or neither, or both, the truth remains the same. You are never meant to be divided. You are meant to be united. And perhaps that is the greatest revelation of all. Thank you for watching. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're ready to dive deeper into the forgotten wisdom of the past, hit subscribe, because the journey has only just begun. Until next time, seeker of truth, stay curious, stay open, and remember, all that matters is how much you loved.